In this section, we'll continue our introduction and overview of the Great Depression of the 1930s, which we began in the first section. Underlying all the statistics that were covered in that first section was, of course, the horrible human dimension, the suffering that went along with the economic downturn. Keep in mind that at this time, there was none of the Social Security or welfare net that we have today. If you're unemployed today, you can apply for unemployment benefits, and if your unemployment lingers, perhaps food stamps and Medicaid could kick in. None of that was present in the 1930s. The first thing you do back then is sell all your assets just to stay alive, usually at an incredibly depreciated value. People were near starvation, something Americans really can't even imagine today. People would dig through trash for just scraps of food. In reality, few starved due to the hard-pressed charities. The American Red Cross, founded in the Civil War, and the Salvation Army did their best work with soup kitchens and medical care. In fact, the Depression is synonymous with long lines of silent and humiliated men waiting in line for bread handouts. There's the famous picture of a formerly wealthy man standing next to his fancy car saying he'd sell the car for $100 just so he could buy some food. Synonymous with the Depression was the hobo, groups of homeless men riding in boxcars from city to city looking for work. There's some debate about where the term hoboy came from, whether the term hoe boy, as in an agricultural hoe, meant farmhand, or a greeting such as ho boy. Anyway, some have said it was a railroad greeting, ho boy. Others said it was an abbreviation of homeward bound, H-O from homeward, a B-O from bound. It could also have come from of the phrase of the writer H.L. Mencken, who referred to the homeless boy. In any event, hobos are synonymous with the 1930s traveling on these trains. They would arrive in these towns, but of course none of the towns had jobs for them and just wanted them to keep going. Although starvation wasn't too widespread, suicide rates climbed 30% between 1929 and 1933. One example, in Youngstown, Ohio, a 57-year-old jobless father of 10 jumps to his death from a bridge as his landlord prepared to evict his family from their home. In this graph, you can see that suicides always mirror the economy, and to the far left, when the economy was really bad in the Great Depression, you can see the spike in suicide rates. Marriage rates declined, not surprisingly, because people were afraid to take on dependents when they were out of work. Divorce rates surprisingly declined, and that wasn't because of the fact that marriages were surviving. It was just that divorces cost money, and men were often abandoning their families, not even incurring the cost of the divorce. Of course, birth rates declined as well, because to the extent that you control fertility, no one wanted additional mouths to feed. With abandonment growing, with the hobos heading out on the rails, women faced tremendous burdens, often left alone to care for their children. It is counterintuitive and interesting to note that the percentage of women in the workforce in the 1930s actually grew. Now, that is the percentage of people working, not the actual number, but the percentage of people that were working, that were female, actually grew. And that's because a lot of the most hardest hit areas in unemployment were the middle management and white collar style jobs. The menial jobs that needed to be done were still considered below like former bank managers or white collar workers, and it was left to women to do these jobs. And again, they had no choice when they were left alone to take care of the kids. Children were also hit hard. The number of malnourished children skyrocketed. Schools, hurt by the dwindling tax revenues, often shortened the school year and, in some cases, even closed schools. Thousands of children were completely out of school by 1933, not a good sign for any society. Newspapers reported the story of a rural school teacher who told a young little girl who looked sick to go home and eat something. She replied, "I can't. It's my sister's turn to eat." The elderly were also hit hard. They had perhaps done everything they should have done throughout their life, put some money aside for their retirement, saved for a rainy day, and yet they lost it all when the banks went bankrupt. They were too old to work and they had no money for the future.
During the Great Depression, it was a very difficult time for organized labor. This shouldn't be too surprising because when unemployment is high, there are a lot of people that would be available for scab work. Organized labor unions work to try to maximize their power. And one way they tried to increase their leverage was with the sit-down strike. Rather than leave the plant and walk around on the sidewalk with a sign, what they would do is plot down right on the job. They'd sit down in the factory itself. And this, of course, required the management to physically remove them, and it meant the operation was shut down longer and the strike was more effective. The first sit-down strike was against General Motors in Flint, Michigan in 1936. Of course, the labor relations during the Great Depression were very harsh and sometimes violent. You see this probably best in the famous or infamous Memorial Day Massacre on May 30th, 1937, outside Chicago. A number of strikers were striking against several small steel companies called Little Steel, and the management called in the cops, and things got violent, and the police opened fire, and 10 people died and 30 were injured, including 9 with permanent injuries. A coroner's jury later wrote in a pro-business opinion that the killings were, quote, justifiable homicide. The Memorial Day Massacre is yet another example of sort of a black eye in American labor history. In the middle of the 1930s, a number of union leaders began to consider a new type of union, an industrial union. The American Federation of Labor, the existing union, was organized according to individual skills. And it occurred to these labor leaders in the AFL, certain labor leaders there, that industries in the modern world employed people with different skills. And so if the union were to be more effective, it should be organized by this industry in which you work in, not your skill level, not your type of skill. And so what they began to do in the middle of the 1930s is to consider sort of separating from the AFL and forming a new union. And this union was named the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and it was launched in 1938. It proved a rival union to the AFL until just after World War II, when they merged, and today, of course, we've got the AFL-CIO.
The Communist Party reached its all-time peak in the 1930s. It was never anywhere near a real threat to American democracy, as we'll discuss later, but it was in the numbers of well in excess of 300,000 Americans. America sent representatives to international meetings of communists in Moscow, the so-called Communist International. To make matters worse was the Great Dust Bowl on the Plain States in the 1930s. During the 1920s, farmers had tried to make up for declining prices by producing ever more. They had exhausted the soil. On the plains, there's a very thin topsoil. When in the 1930s there was a period of excessive heat and not much rainfall, this topsoil was depleted and was blowing with the wind, making massive dust storms that made it difficult to farm. In 1930s, there were in one summer almost 60 days of temperatures above 100. These dust storms were truly amazing. It could blow so hard it could blow dust through the cracks in a wood-framed house. The dust storms could cover a complete wagon. It was impossible to farm, and it's really just hard to imagine today. This concludes the section on the overview and the introduction to the Great Depression.